Alrighty. Um, I always, at times like this, so lecture 9.5, the last lecture of the course, I always remember this book that I read as a child. It was a Sesame Street book, and it's called The Monster at the End of the Book. And all through the book, you kept being warned that there was going to be a monster waiting at the very end of the book. And so you were sort of like, watch out, scary monster at the end of the book. Turned out the monster at the end of the book was just Grover, who was a friendly monster. So everything was okay in the end. So I always feel like when we're at this point in the course, this is the monster at the end of the book. The monster here will not be Grover. I've got this labeled as Tearful Goodbye. I don't think I will actually cry. Maybe you will. I don't know. We won't know. Everything's remote. But this is what all I'm really hoping to do here is to kind of bring together the journey. So it has been already a long journey. You've only covered half the textbook. I know that some of you are doing Psych AO2, so perhaps you've done the whole textbook. For the rest of you, the other half of the textbook is Psych AO2. And if you've liked what you've learned here, you'll probably like AO2. They're similar but different. And I'll highlight that a little bit here, where this course was really, we're going to kind of go through chapter by chapter, and I'm going to talk about things a little bit. But if we think big picture, this course was primarily about trying to understand the average human being and the basic systems that we use. Understanding our brain, our biology, understanding our perceptual systems, our memory, our attention systems, consciousness, how conscious and unconscious interact. At the end, talking about things like thought and language. But it was all really kind of, imagining an individual like us and trying to understand us. In Psych AO2, we'll consider those individuals in a larger context, there's chapters on things like development, but there's chapters on like what makes people different from each other. So like about personality and intelligence, so-called individual differences, and we haven't really focused on that in this course. You'll also run into social psychology, which is about how humans impact each other, the social influences that we have over each other. And of course, there'll be a big chunk about clinical psychology, how sometimes the world is just an extremely challenging place and can sometimes give rise to biologically based mental disorders or, just reality based mental disorders, anxiety disorders, emotional disorders, depression, etc. So you'll learn about some of these disorders, and you'll also learn about some of the treatment approaches that are currently around. So if that sounds interesting to you, that's Psych AO2. What I'm going to do in the rest of this lecture is just remind you of some things that we talked about in this course, and to sort of tie things together a little bit now that we're here at the monster at the end of the book. So we're just going to go chapter by chapter, and again, reminding you things. So if we think about chapter 1, some points I really hope you leave this course with. First one, psychology is a very young science. And unlike philosophy, sure, but physics, chemistry, biology, if you decide to work in those areas, there's certainly a lot of interesting work to be done, a lot of interesting questions to still answer, but you're more into the details. A lot of the big questions in those areas have been answered. Whereas in psychology, we're barely over 100 years old as an empirical discipline. As every new technology develops that helps us see the brain, the mind in more detail, we have an ability to learn and ask brand new questions, learn new answers. So it's a really exciting young field. And so I hope you have that. So the most influential work is still to come, and you might be the one that does it. I always found this really exciting as a student. It's like, hey, I could be part of really shaping a relatively young science. And that's certainly true within psychology. It's also extremely broad. That's what I hope you got from chapter 1 and from what you've been experiencing so far. That we go all the way from a real biology kind of neuroscience how does the brain work, axons, neurotransmitters, that kind of thing. But we go all the way up to questions like personality, and even clinical issues. So it's so broad. And there's probably something within this realm that you find really interesting, if not a lot of it. And so that's what I hope you got from chapter 1. There's this broad area. It's young. There's a lot of cool stuff yet to come. You might be part of that. Okay, you might carry on that history of psychology. Cool. What about number 2? Chapter 2. I mean, chapter 2 is really important, especially in this sort of post-truth world we find ourselves in, where everybody seems to think, oh, I can just go and look online and come to my own opinion about the truth of something. The scientific method was developed after decades and centuries of scientists trying to find the right way, the best way, the most accurate way to get at the truth of something. And, that learning has been sort of embroiled within the scientific method. So that's why we really want you to understand the power of the scientific method, the power of making predictions and then testing those predictions, and how you go about doing that, and how that can lead you to something like the truth. So yes, experiments are the best way, in fact, really the only way to get at causal relationships. And causal relationships are the basis of our understanding of everything. What causes something to happen? And experimentation is the approach. We think of psychology as a science because we embrace this empirical approach to getting new knowledge. Along the way, we've talked also about correlations, and I hope what you take from this is that correlations can guide future research. They can give you a sense of things that are going on, but they are dangerous in and of themselves. You have to be careful to understand the limits of correlations. So I don't think I talked about this one out loud, but I'll throw this one out for you. It turns out that there's a correlation between cheeseburgers and cancer, and it's not what you think. The more cheeseburgers you eat, the less likely you are to die of cancer. It's a negative correlation. And wow, if you first read that, you think, well, I don't want to die of cancer. What does that suggest? I should eat a lot of cheeseburgers. So there's an implied causality there, right? That something, what is it, the cheese or something about the cheeseburger that prevents cancer? The reality of this correlation is the following. If you eat a lot of cheeseburgers, you die of heart disease before cancer can get you. In order for cancer to get you, you have to be alive long enough for cancer to get you. And people who eat a lot of cheeseburgers tend to die young of heart disease. That's why they don't die of cancer. So again, all of this to suggest that correlations can be tricky. They can give you a sense of relations between things, but you really need experiments to get to the actual causal role that variables are playing. So I hope you have a good understanding of that now. And I hope you also understand that what you learned in chapter 2 is not the end of the story. The science of psychology continues to evolve. And with big data and AI and all these new technologies we have for seeing the brain, the science itself is going to develop with these technologies. And that will be the methods that we use, but also the tools that we use as we go through things. So again, another reason why it's kind of exciting to be, part of the science of psychology at this point in time. That's chapter 2. Chapter 3, we got into the brain. And the biology and neuroscience side of the brain. And so the important stuff I hope you got from chapter 3 is that when I say 3/4 of your brain is dedicated to recognizing and understanding, what I'm actually meaning there is your occipital lobe, your temporal lobe, and your parietal lobe. So your cortex has 4 areas, 4 categories of cortex, and 3 of those are about input from the world and making sense of that input. So I hope you really have a good, clear sense now that when you are perceiving the world, you're really just getting some of the information from the world, and your brain is doing a whole lot to help that information make sense to you. So I hope you understand now how active the process of perception is, and the role that your previous experiences and biases have in terms of how you see the world. We mentioned at one point that if you're bilingual, you actually see the world differently. Your linguistic abilities affect how you perceive the world. And so, that's an important thing. We do not all perceive the world the same way. And that's why we sometimes run into conflict and issues in various ways. The other quarter of your brain, the frontal lobes, is really dedicated to considering the input, combining them with our goals, and ultimately, in a conscious way, determining behavior. Now, one of the things you've learned all through this is, hey, the unconscious mind is also affecting behavior all the way through, but the frontal lobes are where our conscious influences come from, our goal-directed behavior, and that all comes from the frontal lobes. At the same time, and I've emphasized this throughout, the oldest parts of our brain, like the limbic system, often will dominate the frontal lobes. And so we're often more driven by emotion and instinct and habit than we are by rationality. We don't feel that way. We embrace the rationality. But in fact, a lot of our responses are just that: habit, instinct, emotionally based responses. That's a big part of who we are. The more we understand that, the more we appreciate that, the more informed we are about ourselves. Okay. That was chapter 3. We're doing it kind of a whirlwind here. We skipped chapter 4. That was the development chapter. And so we got into chapter 5, sensation and perception. And what I hope you got from that is that the world that we perceive is only a small part of what's out there. We feel like what we see is the world, but in fact, we are limited by our sensory systems. We are a primarily visual organism. That's our favorite sensory system. If we imagine just smells, we know that dogs smell all these things out there that we don't even know exist. Other animals are sensitive to other stimulation and perceive the world very differently as a result of that. So, we are really just perceiving a small part of what's out there. And yeah, a big part of how we perceive is that making sense that we talked about. And so our previous experiences in life really affect the way we see the world now. We're kind of always seeing the present through a lens of the past. It's actually shaping how we see the present. A lot of this happens without us even being aware. So a lot of this recognizing and categorizing of the stimulus that's coming in is happening by very low and primitive parts of our system, those unconscious processes, and we're really only aware of the final product, what we actually see. And so I call this recognized and categorized. There's a chair over there, a dog over there. Yeah, there's a cute little dog over here, for example. I don't know. Can you see her? All right. Now I've completely messed things up. I don't know where I am on this camera. That's okay. Maybe my head's cut off. That's okay. Yeah. So we're only seeing a small part of the world in the first place, and then how we see it depends on our previous experiences and such. Okay. Then we got into consciousness, and what are the main points from here? First of all, we can only seemingly be conscious of one thing at a time. So this is like our working memory, right? And because it's working, what's in our consciousness is constantly changing. It seems to be a very dynamic, active thing. They are especially important, these conscious processes, when we're facing new problems or when we're trying to behave in a new way to old problems. So I'll call that changing habits. So yeah, the first time someone says, hey, let me show you the right way to throw a frisbee. If we've never thrown a frisbee before, then when we're first doing it, we're doing it very consciously. We're watching, we're saying, okay, they hold their hand that way. They seem to flick their wrist in this way. So let me try to do that, right? And so that we need our conscious mind to kind of guide us on that new problem-solving task. But just as much, maybe somebody says, hey, I've seen you throwing a frisbee. You're doing it the wrong way. Let me show you the right way to throw a frisbee. Well, now you have a habit of doing it the wrong way. If you want to overcome that habit, you need your conscious mind to say, no, don't do that thing you want to do. Do it this way. So this is what we think the conscious mind is really important for, helping us solve brand new problems or helping us solve old problems in new ways, sort of escaping habitual ways of doing things. Cool. At the same time as we're consciously perceiving things, we're also perceiving things without awareness. And these things that we're perceiving without awareness, that we're not even aware we're perceiving, they can still trigger habitual responding, and they can also influence the way we consciously think about things. The example I'll have you keep in mind here is the notion of somebody's telling you something about something that happened to them. You're hearing the words, but you're also seeing their nonverbals. And you may find yourself in a state where you say, yeah, that's what they said, but I don't believe them. Why don't you believe them? Potentially, your unconscious mind was processing their nonverbals and saw signs of lying. The person maybe did a little bit of this, which is a worry, which we tend to all worry when we're lying a little bit. We have a slight worry. The unconscious mind wouldn't know exactly what it's detecting. It would just give your conscious mind the sense that it doesn't ring true. I'm not buying it, what that person's saying. And so the unconscious mind can bias the way we consciously think of things, even though we don't know what's causing those influences. Okay, so we've seen that dance between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind play out all through this course. And I think, that's an important one. And so I've highlighted it through. All right, chapter 6, on to 7. 7 was learning. And so this is when we got into the era of behaviorism and talked about, a number of things. So we talked about different ways we can learn, including social imitation. Observational learning is sometimes called. So this is probably one of the earliest ways children learn. We have this phrase, monkey see, monkey do. We see somebody do something, and we have this habit of imitating, and we can learn behaviors from other people in that way. One of the sort of earliest forms of learning. But also, of course, we can start to bring in things like classical conditioning, right? So we're also wired where our brain is always trying to look for causal relationships. It wants to be able to predict what's going to happen. So if it knows, every time that person does that, this happens next, then we can start to predict the future based on the present, right? And that's really what classical conditioning is all about. When an animal starts to understand that when that bell goes off, food comes just after, then it can predict that future and it can prepare for that future. And so that's one very powerful form of learning that we saw in classical conditioning. We also said, we can take this further. As we behave, consequences happen. So we find ourselves in some situation, we behave a certain way, and either good or bad things happen as a result. And those consequences probably change. Well, we know from research, they change the likelihood of us behaving that same way in the future. They can make it more likely, they can reinforce the behavior, or they can make it less likely. This is the world of operant conditioning. Okay. One of the things I wanted to emphasize about this whole chapter was, a lot of people are like, well, why is there so much animal research? Why did it become this sort of rat research? And that was because the people doing the research thought that these mechanisms of learning were just very core, deep, instinctual parts of us. And so they were just as much a part of us as they were a part of the rat. Because they thought these learning mechanisms were so primitive, they thought you could study them in any animal and what you learned would apply to the human. Often that seems to have been true. Many of the things we've learned from this era of psychology, we continue to use today. One of our most common forms of research involves bringing in behavioral parts to what we do to help the person deal with certain issues that they have. So it continues to be a huge part of psychology today, even though we've kind of moved beyond these specific kinds of experiments. What we learned from them, we continue to leverage. Okay, so that was a very important chapter. Now we had 2 other chapters, one on memory. What are the main ones for the memory? This feels like a bit of a laundry list, but it's an important one. First of all, I hope you take from this that from a psychological point of view, the concept of memory is bigger than how we use it colloquially. We tend to, what we talk about with memory, a psychologist would refer to as autobiographical or episodic memory. So that replaying of some past event. But in reality, in the psychology world, anytime some experience from your past is affecting how you're behaving now, that's memory. Okay, the past carrying over to the present. And what we've found is that there's a lot of ways that happens. There are multiple memory systems that have different roles and characteristics. So yeah, remember that model of memory, which had the iconic and echoic memory store, had working memory, had long-term memory, and even within long-term memory, we can talk about episodic, semantic, procedural. So there are all these different kinds of memory that all work in slightly different ways. And so, as I told you, memory in a psychology world is actually a plural verb because there's a lot of systems and they all they don't just store stuff often. They're much more active and dynamic than that, hence the verb kind of notion. That core memory that we think of, episodic or autobiographical memory, that gives us the illusion of replaying past experiences. But what we're really seeing is not a replay of that past experience, like if we were watching a video, but rather it's a recreation. Every time we relive the past, we're recreating the past. And every time we do so, new errors are sneaking in. But we can't see the errors. To us, the recreation seems accurate. So every time we recount a memory, we distort it somewhat. Remember those owls that turn into the cat? So that notion of recreation in memory. So I hope you leave here with a sense of that. Okay. And then finally, chapter 9, language. What were the main points here? First of all, humans do seem unique in their ability to use language. We are using language in the rich ways that no other animals do. That we do see language capabilities in a lot of animals, but just not at the level of richness of human language. And, that allows us to communicate learning and information in ways that no other animal cannot. And if you think of our physical attributes, we do not deserve to be the dominant species on this planet. So many other species, a grizzly bear, you name it, could beat us up easily, physically could dominate us. But we are really good at learning and information and sharing information in highly complex ways. That allows us to do things like build houses that almost no animal could ever think of building. There's some cool houses in the animal world, but not like ours. Building cities, all this kind of stuff. That's a function of our frontal lobes, but also our ability to share and work together. And language is a core part of that. So yes, highly critical to where we are. We know that there may be critical periods. And this is just an interesting issue in and of itself. But certainly for language, there seems to be a period of time when a child really needs to be exposed to language. If they pick it up quick. But if they go past that period and miss the opportunity, then they may not be able to pick it up so quick after that. And so we also wonder whether there aren't critical periods for other sorts of learning, other perceptual kinds of learning, etc. And so that notion of critical periods is now sort of out there more generally as well. When it comes to solving problems, while we like to think of ourselves as rational and strategic, and while we can bring a rational strategic approach to bear, we generally rely more on these heuristics, these cognitive shortcuts, to kind of get us where we need to get at. That's a very human way of doing things. So let me just talk about this one a little bit more, and I'll give you let me give you this example. So when I was young, we sent a man to the moon. Okay, I was 4 years old, so I was very young. but a man was sent to the moon. That whole NASA era, when NASA was sending people to the moon, that was the height of human rational thought. It was the engineers and the mathematicians. And by the way, there's some really cool stories about. I haven't seen that movie, but there's a story about some black female mathematicians that were critical to the whole NASA mission. They were the height of rational thought. They were really good at mathematics. In order to like send something to the moon and land it and bring it back, you have to have all the details highly accurate. You need to use rational thought. And you need to use formal versions of it like mathematics and engineering in order to make this all happen. That was when humans landed a person on the moon. That was, and to some extent still is, the height of human success with rational thought. I mean, we've now landed things on Mars and other places, etc. Those are examples of humans really engaging their frontal lobes and really doing things in a very strategic, formal, mathematical way. So we can do it. And some of us are really good at doing that. But in our day-to-day lives, it's not very natural. It's not the way we do our usual problem solving. We tend to rely on these heuristics like the availability bias, like the representation bias, etc. that I told you about. So we're not very good at being logical and rational. It's hard work for us. Cool. That's sort of the big story of what of the tour that we've been through. That's a lot of information, right? And so what always makes a course like this challenging is that like none of the parts are that hard. There's just so much to learn. And so I wanted to summarize some of those key points that I hope you take away from the course. But let me also mention, very early in this course, I posted an announcement that said, how do I do well in this course? Let me remind you about that announcement. And, maybe as you prepare for the final, you want to go back to that and check that out and use some of the tips I've given you there. Okay. Otherwise, let me just zoom out and say, it's been a weird course. I really look forward to being face-to-face, real-time again in a classroom, seeing your faces when I lecture, having that vibe. Something is lost doing it this way, but I know from your side, it takes so much self-monitoring, self-management to get yourself in front of these lectures, to watch them, to do the readings, to do everything that's involved in learning a course like this. Thanks to all of you guys who've put in that effort. And I look forward to seeing some of you guys in person. I wish you all the best on this exam and on your exams in general. Yeah, look forward to seeing you at UTSC. Thank you all. Have a great end of the summer. I'll see you in the fall. Bye-bye.